And our first presenter is, of course, our president, Dr. Jesus Jesse Esparza. And I just want to give you, hi, Jesse, a little background on Dr. Esparza. He is an associate professor of history in the College of Liberal Arts and Behavioral Sciences at Texas Southern University, where he has taught since 2009. His area of expertise is on the history of Latinos in the United States, emphasizing civil rights activism. Dr. Esparza's manuscript, Raza Schools, The Fight for Latino Educational Autonomy in the West Texas Borderlands Town, was released in September of 2023. The University of Oklahoma Press published it as part of the New Directions in Tejano History series. Dr. Esparza teaches Mexican-American, Texas, and civil rights history. He received his BA and a master's degree in history from Southwest Texas State University and a PhD in history in 2008 from both of our alma mater, the University of Houston. Dr. Esparza, welcome and thank you for presenting today.
Thank you, Professor Meeks, and thank you, Adrian, and everybody, the Texas Oral History Association, for this wonderful invitation, this wonderful opportunity to showcase my work. My most recent publication, Nico mentioned, my book that's come out in September called Raza Schools. I'm going to share screen here. I have a PowerPoint that I want to share also with the audience as we get through this conversation. So September of this year, and it's titled here, as you can see on the first slide, Raza is the literal translation for race, and I do mean race in many senses when I talk about these school districts. But Raza also sort of very also means the people, and so it's a play on words in many ways. So it stands for both race and also the people, as in the people school. And I want to begin sort of this brief conversation by talking a little bit of the oral histories that I did for this project. I used and I rely heavily on oral histories. I give a lot of credence to that methodology, and I look at oral histories and treat them as historical authority. That is to say that I put as much weight on the testimonies of individuals as I would, let's say, a newspaper clipping or an item found in an artifact or a research facility, and those kinds of things. And so I think oral histories are fantastic for the way they fill in the gaps. I think they're wonderful also for the way that they offer these counter narratives where they correct imbalances in the stories. I like also how they fill in the void, right? They fill in the gaps in the stories. I like how they become the record when no record exists. And this is what oral histories do. I like the relevance they bring to the communities and towns, no matter their location, no matter their size. And I do all these things as a way to help write the story. This story, in many ways, the story of San Felipe and the story that we're going to talk about here in a moment, a lot of it's gleaned through oral history. I did then is I interviewed 43 persons for this project who at one time were either the administrators, the teachers, the students, or the parents who sustained this school district. I had to be very careful also in how I crafted questions. I learned very immediately, as the story is going to reveal here in a moment, this is a very tempestuous kind of history. And oftentimes the line of questionings that I had forced a lot of these storytellers, these narrators, to revisit trauma, and that was not my intent. And so I had to recalibrate in my approach in the way I asked these questions, and we'll talk more about near the end of today's short conversation, and certainly in the Q&A. But I asked the open-ended questions and streamlined questions to sort of get a sense of an individual's overall experience, but also to establish a chronological history of this school district. And so I conducted 43 interviews. When I first started doing this project, you can see here on the slide that I used what we might consider today, right, sort of vintage technology. I used the mini tapes and the mini recorders, and about half of the interviews are on these little mini cassettes. And then what I also did is I used the interview I did and I combined that with interviews that others have done. Like, for example, there were tons of interviews of the persons from this community were done by colleagues of ours over at Texas Christian University, who in 2015 began a massive project to interview civil rights activists, brown, black, and white from across Texas. And certainly many persons from the community that I studied in this book were interviewed as well. And so what I did is I sort of took those and added those to the interviews that I did so that I can create a more balanced and accurate narrative of the history of this community. And so I wanted to stress here the importance just for a moment of doing oral histories. Again, I give a lot of historical authority and a lot of credence to oral histories, and I recommend that you all do the same. I think that those are as important, if not more important, as sometimes the files and the documents we find in our archives. Now, all of that to say is oral histories allowed me then to learn in many ways a very intimate history of a one-of-a-kind school district in a West Texas Borderlands town in the city of Del Rio. Del Rio is about 3 hours west of San Antonio. It's a town. It sits on the border between Mexico and the United States. In this city, in the city of Del Rio, there is a community, a Mexican-American community that would have been formed there in the mid-1800s. It's known as San Felipe. And the families who arrived to this community, the initial family, would come from the north and northwestern portions of present-day Mexico, and they would move for a variety of reasons. Right? We can talk about the push-pull factors. Move for a variety of reasons, and come into this community, and then in this community, for a variety of reasons, settle in this community and begin to engage in what I call barrio formation. That is to say that they begin to develop the entire region. These families are intellectuals. These families are entrepreneurs. These families are a literate population. These families open up businesses. They establish all kinds of business community. They then recruit other families to come into the area of Mexico, and then other families from throughout Texas and throughout the United States would come to this area as well, so that by the late 1800s, there's a sizable population that exists in this community. And then this population would begin, again, develop this community and begin to really establish institutions like never before. Like there will be countless businesses that these families would establish there. They would establish several religious institutions. I mean, you have significant religious diversity in this Mexican American lands community. So they're not all Catholics. You'll have a sizable Baptist and Methodist and Presbyterian population there. They would also establish several social clubs. They would establish also several political organizations. They would also be influential in developing the area's early educational institutions. One of the first things that they would form are escuelitas. Escuelitas is Spanish for like little schools. And what they were is they're private-run schools that sometimes and most times were held in people's residences. And this is where ethnic Mexicans, right, Mexican Americans, often received instruction, the 3 R's. Received it there because quite likely, or most likely, would be prohibited from attending any of the county schools or public schools that would have existed in the area. And so these are these families who are then sort of taking to determine their own education and the education of their children, right? We nation, and they develop these schools where students learn reading, and they learn it in both, mostly in Spanish, but also in English. So a lot of it's bilingual. It's very similar to the way we might think about dual language instruction today. Teach history and culture and those kinds of things. And so these would be the earliest schools that these communities and these families would form. Certainly, also be responsible for establishing religious schools. They would also be responsible for managing the county schools. And then in 1929, it's going to be these families who are going to establish the San Felipe Independent School District. San Felipe is named after the community from where it's birthed in this West Texas town. Now, this is a unique independent school district. This is not, right? This is perhaps the first and only known independent school district that was organized by Mexican Americans at the height of Jim Crow. To say that Mexican Americans in 1929, despite the aggressive methods to disenfranchise them, to segregate them, to mass incarcerate them, that Mexican Americans, despite those things, are going to triumph significantly and establish the first completely controlled independent school district. I'm not saying that this is a schoolhouse in a traditional white school district. I'm saying that this is an independent school district with at first 2, ultimately 5 schoolhouses that are managed by Mexican Americans. And so in some of the interviews that I conducted, people were very proud to reveal to me that this is believed, right, to be the only school system of its kind, making it a very unique district. This doesn't exist anywhere else. There are schoolhouses Americans are assigned to, that they are segregated to, but that told to go there. This is a school district in where Mexican Americans organize, avoid being segregated in what they would consider traditional white school districts. And what I mean by control, I mean that Mexican Americans controlled every aspect of this district. They were, for example, this is the first school board members that would take form in 1928, 29. They were also the superintendents. This is Gilbert Cerda. He can trace his origins back to those original families that arrived years earlier into that community. That's him, a long line of educators. Also the principals, they were the counselors, they were certainly the and because these Latinos and because these Mexican Americans controlled the school district, they then were responsible for determining who taught in them, and then perhaps more importantly, how they in them. And this is what they were able to do. I should state also that the district also invited and had for a short some very famous and now renowned scholars and educators that were it. They would have, for example, Dr. Carlos Castañeda, who was a professor of history at the University of Texas in Austin, and one of just a few ethnic Mexicans that was teaching in an institution of higher learning during the 1930s. And Dr. Castañeda would be invited to come down to Del Rio and serve as a district superintendent. He would do that between 1933 and 1935, being extremely instrumental in the district's formative years. I mean, those are the rough growing pains, and Castañeda would sort of steer the ship there. Also invited to come and work for the district was a scholar and an author in her own right, Jovita Gonzalez, who was a trained historian, and she would come and work as an English teacher, and then move up and become the department head, and do a whole host of things, also playing a very significant and instrumental role in the district's formative years. And I would say also about Jovita Gonzalez, and not only that she's an intellectual of the period, she's also the person arguably most responsible for creating the single most extensive body of literary work of any Mexican American in the 1930s. And so that's the kind of skill and expertise that Jovita Gonzalez is going to bring into this district, into San Felipe ISD in the early 1930s. She would stay there for most of the 30s. I think she leaves in 1938. The other thing that I should mention is that this district, San Felipe, while it hired all kinds of persons, it overwhelmingly hired female educators. And this is telling because one of the things that I noticed in my research early on, and other scholars have already established, is that female educators during the early part of the 20th century found it difficult to land jobs as teachers. Most of those jobs went to men, not in San Felipe. In San Felipe, teachers were overwhelmingly the majority of the educators. And so it's women who are in many ways responsible for driving the curriculum and determining the educational accomplishments of children. And so the district is setting trends, not just within itself, but public schools in the state of Texas. Moreover, these women would use the classroom as a way to assert their own agency. That is to say that they would use the classroom into other kinds of leadership positions. For example, many of these teachers become the heads or the chairs or the leaders of the parent-teacher associations. All school buildings would have parent-teacher associations, and all of them would have a sizable membership. And teachers, these women, would be the ones who are calling the shots. Men are there too, but this is a female organization, and these are women calling all the shots. If they're not running the PTAs, they're also then serving as faculty advisors. They're serving as faculty sponsors, going off with students in clubs, drama clubs, UIO competitions, those kinds of things. And if they're not that, then they're also using the classroom as a way to engage into the political outside of the classroom. And so the classroom space becomes very important for these female educators, that it allows them and to assert their own agency in very significant ways. The district also prided itself, and I had learned this also through oral history, the district prided itself on establishing a very sort of strong teacher pipeline. And what I mean by that is that many of the teachers who were hired by the district after 1932, really after 1936, 37, many of those teachers would be faculty members who had once attended the schools in San Felipe. And so children, right, born in that community, go to school in that community, graduate to college, they go to San Marcos, or they go to Dallas, or wherever they go to UT Austin. They get teacher certifications, right? They get their teacher certification. Then they come back and they go back to their community and they get employed by the very district that they graduated from. So that San Felipe, in many ways, is producing, right, its own sort of homegrown teachers in many ways. And so this would be a very significant trend. And almost every decade, there would be teachers who come up through that community, who come back and work for that community, countless teachers who would do so. And I list many of them in the book. And so this is very significant, because if we consider the history of the Latino students in Texas, and we consider the history of the Mexican-American student in Texas, we understand that it's a history of educational equality. We know, for example, and others have already established this, we know, for example, that Mexican-Americans are segregated, arbitrarily suspended or expelled. We know that they are exposed to a curriculum that's devoid of their history, or a curriculum that criminalizes them, or we know that they're confronted with hostile teachers and counselors. They are tracked into vocational or occupational kinds of classes, which prepares them for the service industry as opposed to preparing them for an institution of higher learning. And that in many ways is going to underscore and privilege the rich. We know that their financing was inherently racist. We know that students, the Mexican-American student, receive up to or less, 3/4 less of funding than their white counterpart. We know that their classrooms and their buildings were inadequately built. We know that they were sometimes in electricity and those kinds of things. And so these are the kinds of things that plagued community. But in San Felipe, a lot of those things didn't exist. In San Felipe, students were exposed to classrooms, while works in progress were exposed to classrooms that were maintained, classrooms that were upkept, classrooms and schools that were constantly trying to expand to meet student demand. We know that students in this community were subjected to a rigorous curriculum that provided them with instruction, prepared them for college. We know that students in this community, in this district, encountered teachers who understood their history, their culture, and who did not expect less of them, but expected more of them, probably of themselves. And so these are the kinds of things that existed in San Felipe, that very sort of unique kind of environment, an insular environment is how I describe it in the book, an environment that is going to protect and nurture and prepare to not just graduate from high school, but also then to successfully perform in an institution of higher learning. And perhaps the most important is to, outside of this community, in what would be a hostile society. Mexican Americans who in the 30s, 40s, and 50s are victims of various diseases, and an education is the best way to achieve a sense of equality. And this is what is happening in this community, in the San Felipe community. I know also that this district is going to establish several educational programs that are to either keep students in the classroom or that are designed to return students to the classroom. And what you see here is you see a flyer of a night school program right in the 1930s. They would operate this program twice. They would do it in the and then again in the 1940s, and they do it both times because of large sort of occurrences that would disrupt the education of seniors in the schools. In the 30s, mentioned that it'll be the Great Depression that is going to end a lot of the schooling for these children as they have to leave the school, leave with their families as their family of the city, possibly even leaving out of the states to go find work. Come back, they come back 2 or 3 or 5 years later, and they then high school where they can complete their high school education. Then it happens again in the 40s. It happens when the U.S. enters into the Second World War, and there's a sizable number of men overseas who and in every branch of the U.S. military and who fight in everything of the Second World War. And in terms of students, they would send about 45 overseas, and then half of them come back, and the other half killed in action. But the half that do come back, again, would have had their education disrupted as a result of our entry into the Second World War. So they go then back to these night school program to finish their degree. If whether it's 6 months or whether it's a year that they need, they're able to do so. High school program operated at night, and it operated on a Monday through Thursday, sometimes on Monday. And the teachers who were working the night school program were teachers who, for the district, who were already working there from like 7 to 3 or 8 to 4, like that. And so this is double duty in many ways for them. And oftentimes they were paid, but just as often they were not paid. And the teachers stayed there to do it, committed, even without pay, because they understood this was necessary for uplift in many ways. And so a lot of them did this voluntarily. And they would. This is just the tip of the iceberg. They would do countless other programs that were designed to return people to the classroom or to keep them into the classroom. Like, for example, in the 1950s, they would run LULAC's programs called the Little School of the 400, which was an educational program that was designed to provide young children who were entering into the first and second grade, really the first grade, to provide them with 400 basic English words, especially if their first language was not English, if their first language was Spanish, and it would have been in the Texas Borderlands. And the goal was to provide them with 400 basic English words so that when they got to the first grade, they then could successfully stay on par with the rest of their peers and then not have to be retained or not be sent to a remedial class or something like that. And San Felipe ran this program as well. And so it did this. I mean, it had a migrant program, it had an adult basic education program, it had an English literacy program, and it just countless of other things that it did, all of which is going to contribute to a steady and significant graduation rate on the part of this district. This is a picture of the first graduating class in 1932. Only 8 students graduated in 1932. District is founded in 29. The high school is built in 1930, and the first graduating class takes place in 1932. And so the number is small, but throughout the years, the number would continue to grow. This is a class in 1945, for example, that is standing in front of their high school called San Felipe High School. And so this is also telling because, again, if we look at the trends and we look at what's happening to Mexican Americans across the state of Texas, most Mexican Americans in San Antonio, Houston, in Dallas, and in Austin, most Mexican Americans in Texas public schools during the same period aren't receiving an education past the 7th and 8th grade. If they are, they're going to a segregated high school for the 9th and 10th grade levels, and then they never achieve a diploma as a 12th grade student. And so their education is cut short as a result of harsh Jim Crow policies. But in San Felipe, the graduates are steadily increasing. Again, this is sort of another achievement and another very significant piece of information that I talk about in the book. This is a chart that I created that sort of provides the graduation rates by decades, and you can see that in the 30s, only 60 students total graduated, and then in the 60s, 654 students are going to graduate. And then in the 70s, as we'll talk about here in a moment, that number drops to 164 because something else is going to happen that abruptly ends the steady graduation rate. And then you can also see the trends here. You can see that in the first 3 decades or in the first 2 decades, men outnumber women in terms of graduate. But then that begins to change by the 1950s, in that women become the greater number of graduates. And so you'll have a lot of Latinas graduating high school that is taught mostly by Latina faculty, and they're going off to college at a time again, right, when Mexican Americans aren't receiving an education past the 8th grade. Now, on top of all of this, the district also in many ways, I call them campaigns, launched a lot of sort of disaster relief, economic relief, and healthcare campaigns to this community, because a lot of communities was still ravaged by a lot of things. Natural disasters, for example, like floods, were very common in this community, and people were often displaced as a result of flooding that would take place either through the creeks and the rivers in the city, or through Rio Grande, the Rio Bravo, as they would call it there. Those water went into flood often, and displacing people, and the ISD, the district, would come to their aid. Also, a lot of these families didn't have access to services, and so malnourishment and illness and malnutrition a problem as well. But the district held drives. They held drives to give vaccines and inoculations and medication to these families. The district did this and gave it to these families free of charge. And the district also engaged in a lot of fundraising events to try to help people, pay mortgages or work off debt, and those kinds of things. And the district doesn't do these things, but it did those things because it needed to be transformative. It needed to be transformative to the entire community and not just to the students. It needed to be transformative for the students in the classroom, but transformative for the students' families outside the classroom, to achieve true liberation, economic uplift, social uplift, political uplift. And the district did those things. And as a result, the district to really reposition itself as the most cherished institution in that community. A lot of people revealed to me in these interviews that their high school, for example, that was their Carnegie Hall. The high school, for example, was right where they went for relief, and this is where they went to for respite and these kinds of things. And it was their city hall. They couldn't rely on city hall for help. They went to the high school, and they went to the teachers for kinds of things. Now, I also discussed in the book, and I also learned this through other scholars who've addressed similar topics. I learned that San Felipe is not perfect. Certainly it wasn't. It had its problems. And along those lines, right, I learned by speaking to several students from this district that San Felipe also segregated African-American students. This district was overwhelmingly Mexican-American, about 95 to 98% Mexican-American given time. It did fluctuate, but at any given time, it was at least 95% throughout its tenure. And it had white students who attended, and it had African-American students who attended the district. But prior to 1954, all those African-American students attended a segregated school. They attended a school known as the Langston School, or oftentimes called Langston Elementary, although technically wasn't an elementary, as it housed and educated children, African-American children, from grades 1 through 8. And so the school for African-Americans in San Felipe ISD was called Langston, named after Hughes, Negro poet and intellectual. The Langston School, since its inception around the late 1930s, early 1940s, all the way to its demise, 1956, was a school for African Americans. Now, San Felipe, the district could have integrated its Black student population. There was probably never more than 25, maybe, in this schoolhouse at any given time. And so it could have, but it didn't. It subscribed to the same bigoted policies and practices that other school districts did. And so I treat this in the book. It's my chapter book. And when I discuss this, I talk about district sort of failed in its mission. and and again, I'm not, I mean, these are difficult conversations to have, but these are necessary conversations to have. And I say, and I accuse it of falling short of its goal because it had an opportunity in 1920. It had an opportunity to be a truly egalitarian independent school district if it had integrated any African American students in that community. And certainly there were African Americans who lived in that community, origins back to the late 1800s. So certainly they're there. And they just weren't educated up until the 1930s. And then in the 1930s, they were educated, but then educated as a second population. And so this is what I discussed in the book, how it had an opportunity, and it dropped the ball. And I interviewed former students of the Langston. Again, their interviews are really and informing the way I think about integration and the way I think about civil rights, think about agency and resistance and those kinds of things. But the school eventually would be integrated. It would be closed once the nation was forced to reconcile with this bigoted history and this bigoted treatment of African Americans. The district would integrate this population so that by 1950, more segregated schools in the city of Del Rio. Del Rio, by the way, has two school districts that manage it. One is the San Felipe ISD, the one we're talking about, that exists on the east side of town and populates or educates, the population. The other is Del Rio ISD, which sits on the west, which is the larger, more affluent and mostly white school district that is mostly white population. So two schools segregated African Americans, but after 1956, that is the case. And then many students revealed to me that with integration, African American students revealed to me that with integration, that while they celebrate that many sort of found integration getting used to, there they needed to get used to the new setting, new students, new teachers, and they didn't know how to respond yet. But over time, they then would be able to become a more visible population. They would be a population that now is fully integrated into the district like never before. And they begin to thrive within the district. This is, for example, Sidney Blanks. Sid Blanks is going to be one of two of the first African Americans that graduated from San Felipe ISD in 1960. The class of 1960 will be the first class to graduate African Americans. And Sidney Blanks is one of them. And Sid Blanks was a stellar athlete. He would play high school football. He would be recruited to play college football. And then ultimately he would become a member of the National Football League, playing for the Houston Oilers for several years. And so they don't just survive in this integrated school district, they also find ways to thrive in this district. Now, in the interest of time, I want to sort of just talk about the demise of the school district, because San Felipe isn't there anymore. The school district was founded in 1929, and then it would close in 1971. And close is probably not the way to talk about that, but in 1971, that school doesn't exist anymore. And it doesn't exist anymore because of a major lawsuit that takes place in 1971, known as the United States versus State of Texas lawsuit. This is a significant piece of legislation. This is a legislation that is trying to achieve integration and probably brings us closer to truly be integrated state and society, more so than Brown would. After Brown, as most of us know, districts found ways to stall, delay, and even circumvent or outright object to integration orders. Well, the federal courts are going to step in the 1970s, and they use consolidation as a way to try to achieve integration. And so a judge in in Tyler, Texas, closer to me where I'm in Houston, is going to be made aware of these two school districts in West Texas, 6 hours the other way, and learn that these two school districts, by their ethno-racial makeup alone, San Felipe being 95% Mexican American, Del Rio being at least 65% Anglo American, that by their ethno-racial makeup alone, that they are segregated institutions and that they are in violation of the Brown decision in 54 and the Mendez decision in 48, the Delgado, decision in 48. And so this district federal judge is going to force these two districts to consolidate. And so both of these school districts are going to consolidate. And it really just becomes a very tempestuous moment in the 1970s, especially for Mexican Americans from San Felipe who don't want to consolidation as a new way to integrate. They don't want to consolidate. They'd rather be autonomous and independent and separate from Anglo teachers and Anglo schools. And they don't believe that consolidation is going to be an equal merger the way the judge is ordering it. And certainly that was not the case. What happens ultimately is that the smaller San Felipe ISD is going to be absorbed, annexed, if you will, into the larger Real ISD, which was the more affluent and had larger facilities and was expanding at a greater rate than San Felipe was. And so Mexican Americans in this are going to see the intrusion into their community, the loss of their schools. They're going to see the destruction of paraphernalia, the removal of their intellectual and educational achievements and accomplishments. And it just becomes very tempestuous times. Teachers from both sides of town who now have to face each other with daily within the confines of a single school district are going to clash, and they're going to clash over everything. They're going to clash over the most appropriate curriculum. They're going to clash over student financing and funding. They're going to clash over parking spaces. I mean, you name it, they're fighting over everything. They're fighting over positions and these things. And teachers are not learning to get along. Administrators are not getting along. Parents from both sides are not getting along. And then also students would find it difficult along to the integration order, and students become very unruly. And you see here is you see in this sort of middle panel, you'll see that's not a dance, that's a pep rally that turned into a fight and then into a mini riot. And these are students who, again, from both sides of town, now within the same building, who are not getting along and then find ways to express your frustration. And those teenagers, they often resort to confrontation tactics. And so this is a fight ensue, and that would spill out of the gymnasium and into the cafeteria and campus and even in the city, and fights galore for the first 2 weeks of the new school year. Over to the right, that's an altercation that would occur the same night at a football game. And so it becomes a very moment and very tempestuous moment. And this is also very unique because look at what Chicanos and activists have been doing since the turn of the century is they've been fighting to destroy the segregationist regime. They've been fighting to integrate. This is happening everywhere. In Edgewood, in HISD, this is happening. And in San Felipe, they're fighting to remain separate. Again, this sort of makes it very unique, a very unique sort of case study to talk about the existence of this district within and outside of the system of segregation. It would ensue and would continue for several more years. Eventually, the 1991 court order is going to be lifted. That happens in 1985. This is where I sort of end my story. I ended in 1985, but I don't end it on, I sort of ended on sort of this note that this is not a story of loss. While I do talk about the last two chapters, I sort of ended on a note where I talk about and stress the importance of, because Mexican Americans are going to fight. And this is what I argued about the book, that fight, and that they have always fought, and that they have used a wide spectrum to fight. They used the courts, for example. They used City Hall, for example. They engaged in protest politics, for example, or in the case of San Felipe, their own institutions. And then I go on to talk about that they would fight with resources made available to them, and that as long as there are things that continue to oppress them, continue to fight, because this is a story, after all, of resistance and agency, community control. And these are the kinds of things that I discuss in this learned and gleaned through oral history in my newest publication, The Fight for Latino Education Autonomy in the West Texas Borderlands. Now since September, you can find it where books are sold, and please ask to get it as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Esparza. What we want to do now is open up for the floor for questions. So if anyone has any questions, you can either put your question in the chat box, or you can turn on your mic and ask your question.
Hi, my name is Araceli, and I just had a question. Dr. Esparza, from your expertise, do you think that the forced merge was done in an effort to dismantle the Latino community and its unity? Do you think it was a planned effort?
I do. Thank you. Thank Araceli for your question. I do think that because there's a lot of things that are happening in the city of Del Rio between both school districts that lead to consolidation. That judge, Judge William Wayne, who's consolidated all over the place, he's doing it mostly in East Texas, and he's doing it in African American and Anglo American school districts. And African Americans are he learns about what's happening in West Texas, and he learns about something because school leaders from Del Rio ISD tell him about it, alert the judge. Because since the 1950s and really through the 1960s, both school districts, San Felipe ISD, the neighboring school district, they had been fighting with each other over control for students that are housed at a military base there in the city of Del Rio. It's known as Laughlin Air Force Base. It's still there. That base was initially established there in 42. Then it was recommissioned like in 52 or something like that. And then they built housing complexes on there for people who worked for the military and who lived on base. And they lived with their families on that base. There was about 700 to 800 families who lived there. And some of these families sometimes had 2 to 3 kids. And that base technically existed within the boundaries of San Felipe ISD. And so technically, those children were zoned to San Felipe ISD. But those children didn't go to that district. They went to Del Rio ISD, who was a mostly white school district, and these were mostly white families, and who did not want to send their white children to a Mexican school district, right? What they would consider a Mexican school district, or to those Mexican schools, as some parents are quoted as saying. And so they would send them to Del Rio ISD. And in the 50s, the leadership in San Felipe was cool with it. They didn't have the space, they didn't have the resources to expand, so they agreed to the transfer agreement. But in the 60s, a new administration steps in and says, wait a minute, no, those students belong to us. We need to educate those students, and this transfer agreement, we're going to null and void that. That's done. The problem began when when San Felipe ended the transfer agreement because, and not many people know this, and I didn't know this either, but when school districts are educating children that are connected to the military, then the school district that educate them also receive federal funding. They're known as PL funds, monies, millions of dollars to educate these children. And so Del Rio ISD was not just educating these children and getting the ADA credit for it. They were also receiving an additional millions of dollars from the federal government to educate those kids. The new leadership in San Felipe knew this and wanted children so that they could receive those federal monies and so that they could expand to accommodate them. I mean, they had plans to open up a second schoolhouse, a high school, $1 million school that they were going to develop as a result of all these federal monies. Del Rio ISD and San Felipe ISD are fighting with each other over who controls these students, who's going to house and educate these kids. They go to San Antonio before the U.S. Commission of Civil Rights, and the U.S. Commission agrees with San Felipe. They go to the courts in West Texas, the local courts, and the local courts agree with San Felipe. They go to TEA, and TEA agrees with San Felipe. They go to Laughlin Air Force Base and military officials, and they too now agree with San Felipe. And Del Rio, right now, is losing. It's going to lose these students. It's going to lose all this money. They're going to have buildings that are going to be empty. They have this whopping debt that they can't pay. And they say, you know what? We can't afford to lose these kids. Let's go talk to this judge who's consolidating districts. We would rather merge with longtime rivals than to lose these. And it was officials from Del Rio ISD who purposely sought out the judge and says, look what's happening here. We're segregated districts too. You should consolidate us. And that's how it came to be. That's how it came to be. The leadership in San Felipe were shocked when they were called to Tyler, Texas. Tyler, Texas? Where's that at? And why am I being summoned by the judge to go out to Tyler, Texas? And the superintendent of the school district went out there and he gave it the old college try to prevent this consolidation. But it was very difficult for him to defend segregation because technically they were a segregated institution. So it was deliberate. It was deliberate deliberate as a way to save money and make money on the part of the real officials. Thank you for your question, Araceli. I'll take another. I think we have just a few minutes for 2 or 3 more questions or comments.
I have a question, Dr. Esparza. So you stated early on that doing the interviews, you realized that, you brought up possible trauma that the interviewees experienced. But I wonder if you could tell us more about like the process of identifying who you were going to interview, and did you have to cultivate these relationships in order for the interviewees to feel comfortable enough to talk to you?
That's a great question. Thank you, Professor Meeks. So when I first reached out to someone in this community, I went to a museum that's city in this community, in this neighborhood, and I ran into a gentleman there. And hey, look, I'm looking for someone who runs the museum, and it had him, an individual by the name of Guadalupe de Hoyos. They know him as Coach de Hoyos, who was at that time when I met him the board president for the museum. They run a local museum there, and so I worked with him, and it was just fortuitous on my part that's who I got, because he would get access to all those files. I mean, beautiful memorabilia and yearbooks that exist in the museum. It's probably the most extensive. It houses the most extensive collection of historical artifacts for that entire district and community. This museum in San Felipe does. And he would then agree to be interviewed, and he would also broker for me interviews. In fact, I didn't really have to reach out much to many people. They would reach out to folks and say, there's this kid here who's trying to document the history of San Felipe. Come in. And they would call me kid all the time. And they accepted very early on, and I'm not from that community, but they treated me as though I was born in the community, and they understood very quickly that I was not there to, that I wasn't there to extract information and leave. I was invested. I mean, I had actually moved to that community. I lived there for about 2.5 years, and I really assimilated myself to the Borderlands lifestyle, and I really acclimated as best I could. And they that I was sincere in my efforts to really just learn of history. And I respected their authority. I respected their expertise, and there were no gotcha questions. And I learned to do the interview better, because every time that I met, they would immediately start talking about the 1970s and consolidation. And so I had to sort of say, hey, let's pump the brakes and let's back up a little bit. Let's learn about you first. And that really sort of helped me learn them, and they learned me through the kinds of questions that I asked them. This is how, how it came to be. But they accepted me, they treated me well, so that even now when I go back, I'm doing there, or I'm going to reunions there, and they treat me royalty out there, and I feel very privileged to have been a member of that community, and I feel very privileged that I know the persons that I know, and that I'm meeting new persons out of this community. But the oral history for me, they were very easy to do. To recruit, too difficult. I didn't have too much of a difficult time doing it, and the interview takes mostly in their homes, in their private residences. Oftentimes, with the pandemic and the emergence of the pandemic, I would have to do a lot of interviews through phone, through email, or even through Zoom if they were able to Zoom and stuff like that. Interview people several times. I mean, not once were they irked by that, or not once I had to interview one person maybe like 5 times to get clarification or to expand on a topic that was only touched right in the previous conversation. And so I interviewed these persons. I interviewed 43 people. I interviewed 43 people multiple times for this project, some up, and it was a very memorable experience, probably the most memorable experience of my time there was learning these stories and meeting people in their houses and food and stuff like that after the interviews.
I have a question. Dr. Esparza, thank you for your wonderful and enlightening presentation about this school district that sort of represents a really interesting microcosm of sort of ethnic and educational relations within the specific Borderlands community. And I have two questions. I'll start with my first. You mentioned how in the 30s and 40s, what made San Felipe High School unique amongst other schools in Texas is the high prominence of female faculty. And I'm wondering if you could speak more about sort of the gender dynamics when it came to consolidation in the 70s. Were there still a majority of female teachers working in San Felipe, and how did this sort of transition play out within this the specific realm? And then my second, thank you. And then my second question involves more, my work is on as well is on Mexican American Chicano educational activism, specifically the Colegio Jacinto Treviño. And one of the people who has that I've spoken with was a teacher at San Felipe High School in the late 60s, around the time
Aurelio Montemayor.
Exactly, Aurelio. Great, generous, and kind person. And you know, we've talked a little bit about sort of the Marcha del Rio, sort of relating to the Vista Minority Mobilization Program being sort of closed at that time. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more. Did this also come up in your interviews with your narrators?
No, thank you, Derek. Those are great questions. So to your first question, what happens after consolidation is the judge made it clear that no one was supposed to lose their jobs, that the district, the new consolidated district, had to find ways so that everyone kept their jobs. And nobody was fired. Now, many people did quit. A lot of people did leave. A lot of people left education. They changed lanes and did something different. But as far as I can tell, and I don't have the numbers, I didn't document that. That would have been something great to do, and I didn't do that. As far as I can tell, if everyone maintained their jobs, because a lot of these teachers would fight now to regain control of the new consolidated district, is that the numbers would probably stay the same, so that overwhelmingly from San Felipe, it would still be female teachers. Now in Del Rio, that would probably be more men as teachers than women. And the other thing I want to mention is that when you think about the leadership, when you think about school board members and you think about superintendents, none of those were ever women. Those were always men. And so while women make up the majority of the faculty, they never make up the majority or even a sizable number in the administration. And there's something to be said about that as well. The other thing that happens, to answer your first question still, is that while the judge says no one is to lose their jobs, the real officials who had the majority of votes on the school board and all these kinds of things, they found ways to demote people without terminating them. So like, for example, the superintendent of San Felipe ISD in 1970 and 71 was an individual by the name of Homer Sigala. He was the head honcho of San Felipe ISD, but in the consolidated district, starting in 71, he was busted down to assistant superintendent. He had become one of the deputy superintendents. And so it's a demotion, it's not a termination. And this would happen also for a lot of principals that are coming out of San Felipe. And Sigala would fight to reverse that. Sigala would say, no, those principals need to stay as principals. And a lot of Latino faculty in San Felipe did the same thing. And then the last thing I'll say to answer your first question is that what ends up happening is that these former teachers, these teachers from the former San Felipe ISD, they would then try to regain their sense of autonomy and to regain control of the schools that they felt they lost. They would steer the curriculum. They would steer the curriculum in a way that would be tailored to the needs of their children, because they knew that in traditional white school districts, that their kids now would be conditioned in a way for the labor force. Or, right, this is the 1970s, they would be conditioned to join the military. Throwing shade at the military. What I'm saying is those should not be the only options that should be made available to students. And teachers knew that, and teachers wanted to maintain that academic rigor that would prepare them for college and the universities. And they wanted to make sure that their counselors were still talking to students about applying to college and going to college and those kinds of things. So they try to gain control, and they were very successful in doing so, making sure to keep things like bilingual and bicultural education as part of the curriculum that the real officials wanted to cut. I mean, at every opportunity, at every other meeting, they wanted to cut those programs, and the parents and the teachers saying, no way, they need to stay, and they fought tooth and nail to keep those. And so there's a sense of reclaiming and regaining control of something that they lost by way of federal courts. And so I hope that answers your first question. To your second question, I do talk about the Del Rio incident. I talk about it, I think, in my chapter 5. It's a very long chapter as a result of that. And I interviewed Mr. Montemayor, who just had his own book come out, a memoir come out about that as well. And so I talked to him, and the Del Rio incident would be the largest protest that the city of Del Rio would witness. And it would happen in the late 60s, early 70s. And it would, in many ways, do two things: bring the Chicano movement to West Texas in fashion. But what it would also do now is it would begin to fragment the San community as they begin to engage in what I call divergent strategies for achieving equality. Young people, for example, are taken to the streets, engaging in protest politics. They're are with that. They sort of frown upon that and says that's not the way to do that. You shouldn't engage in these processions and in these marches, and you shouldn't be so blatant and out toward law enforcement and these kinds of things. And young people are saying, no, yes, we should, and yes, we are. And what it begins to do is it begins to drive a wedge. It begins with the Chicano movement, Chicanismo in many ways, begins to drive a wedge in what was seemingly impenetrable and unified community, so that when consolidation hits, there's much confusion. I mean, you still have protest marches, you have people who are engaging in different strategies, you have now radical militant organizations that hadn't existed there before, who are sort of causing anxiety, not just for white Del Rioans, but also for older and sort of middle-class mainstream Mexican Americans throughout the city. And a lot of this is happening in the 1970s, adding to the chaos, adding to the confusion, adding to the anxiety. But I do talk about the incidents to some length in the book, in my chapter 5 of the book.
Thank you, Dr. Esparza, for your thorough answers to my questions. I'm looking forward to reading more about it when I get your book.
Appreciate you. Appreciate good luck on that study you're doing. That's an important work.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Dr. Esparza, for such a wonderful presentation and introduction to those who have not already read or heard about Dr. Esparza's book. And I want to thank everyone on behalf of the board members of TOHA for attending. We did have another question in the chat box, and we will, Araceli, we will get your question answered. We will get that to Dr. Esparza, but in the interest of time, because it is now 1:02, we do want to wrap up. But before we do that, I want to invite you to our next Listen, Lunch, and Learn. And we will have our next Listen, Lunch, and Learn in the new year. And please watch out for the invitation from Adrian Kane Darrow. Again, I want to thank everyone for attending. And if you're not a member yet of TOHA, please consider joining.
Yes,
Thank you.
yes, please do so. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I put in the chat. If you have more questions, you want to chat some more, I am available. I love talking. I'll talk shop 24/7. So thank you, Adrian. Thank you thank you, TOHA board members, and all you in attendance for sharing this space with me. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.